Hi, I'm Maggie.
And I'm Marin, and you're listening to
Tell Me I'm Sorry,
a podcast where we deconstruct and muse on depictions of girlhood in film, literature, and other media.
A feminist celebration of pop culture, the audacity of youth, and the ways we grow away from and into our bodies, beliefs, and dreams for ourselves and each other.
And today we are discussing
the virgin suicides.
Directed by Sofia Coppola of the extensive Coppola family. They're all over Hollywood. This was her first film that she directed. She has since developed quite a prolific career as a director. Some of her other films include Lost in Translation, Marie Antoinette, also starring Kirsten Dunst, The Bling Ring, The Beguiled, also starring Kirsten Dunst, and most recently, Priscilla. This movie was also written by Sofia Coppola, though it's worth noting that it is an adaptation of the 1993 novel of the same name by Jeffrey Eugenides. This film premiered at Cannes Film Festival May 19th, 1999. Very, very fancy. And then it had its U.S. theatrical release on April 21st, 2000. So I still consider it a 90s movie. It just feels 90s, even though it's set in the 70s. I was shocked when I read that technical theatrical release date was 2000 because in my brain, it's just a 90s movie.
Yeah.
So, plus it was filmed in the 90s. It's a 90s movie. No poster tagline this week. But we do have a log line from Google this week, which Maggie has not read yet, but she's about to read it to us. And it is a trip.
Okay. Oh, it's so much longer than I thought it was going to be. Because right off the bat, I'm like, okay. In an ordinary suburban house on a lovely tree-lined street in the middle of 1970s America live the 5 beautiful, dreamy Lisbon sisters whose doomed fates indelibly marked the neighborhood boys who to this day continue to obsess over them. A story of love and repression, fantasy and terror, sex and death, memory and longing. It is at its core a mystery story, a heart-rending investigation into the impenetrable, life-altering secrets of American adolescence. Dude, somebody just got out the thesaurus. Why can't I say that word? The thesaurus and but also, what? A story of love and repression, fantasy and terror, sex and death? It is at its core a mystery story? It's just wrong.
It is wrong. I don't even know what it's giving.
Too much.
It's giving too much and nothing at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Plus, it doesn't even actually really give a precursor of the plot, because that's what a logline is supposed to do. It's 1 or 2 sentences about the basic plot that's supposed to pique your interest so you want to watch the movie.
I feel like they just really wanted to use the word indelibly.
Oh, absolutely.
And impenetrable. They thought, and not that those are particularly challenging words, but they are words that read as literary, I think, in ways, or academic, or penetrating, I think, into the psyche of cinema, but in a very superficial fashion. No offense to whoever wrote this logline.
Or maybe it was AI.
That's what I was just thinking. I was actually, it was probably a robot. That would make sense.
Yeah.
A robot would write this and feel good about it if they had feelings.
But they don't. Any other last thoughts on... For me, it's the word terror.
I think it's where it says it is at its core a mystery story. What's the fucking mystery?
Well, I think the mystery that the boys think exists is why did they kill themselves? But that's not the point of the movie.
Right.
part of the point is that there's this disconnect between what is actually happening in these girls' lives and what these boys think is happening. So the idea is that the mystery isn't actually the point, but the boys think the mystery is the point. And this logline is reinforcing what the boys think is the point, but isn't actually.
I think you've just articulated what is ultimately wrong with the logline.
Thank you.
Yes. We got there. You got us there. Minus the like almost like flowery language that maybe you would see in an AP Lit essay, you know?
Yes, exactly. This is giving 11th grader who's read too much F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yes. Yeah.
And is writing this.
Mm-hmm.
And they really want a 5 on their AP exam.
Which a lot of us have been there. No hate.
Yeah.
But wrong. This is wrong for this. Wrong for this.
Yes, good distinction. Okay. Now for an actual explanation of what happens in The Virgin Suicides. The film is narrated by an adult man who is recollecting his upbringing in suburban Michigan in the 1970s. And as an adolescent, and still now, as an adult, the narrator and his friends, the narrator often talks in the first person plural, so we, our. So he's speaking for himself and his friends. When they were adolescents, they were fixated on the 5 Lisbon sisters, who are beautiful and blonde and, in the boys' minds, mysterious because the sisters live a quite sheltered life due to their strict and religious parents. The Lisbon sisters in question are, in order of youngest to oldest, Cecilia, Lux, Bonnie, Mary, and Therese. They are played, respectively, by Hannah Hall, Kirsten Dunst, Chelsea Swain, A.J. Cook, and Leslie Hayman. And their parents are played by James Woods and Kathleen Turner. And at the beginning of the film, the youngest sister, Cecilia, attempts suicide and survives. And the entire neighborhood is confounded by why a 13-year-old girl would try to end her own life. And Cecilia's doctor suggests to Cecilia's parents that she, and by extension her other sisters, would benefit from a less restrictive upbringing and more social interaction, particularly with boys, he says. And Mrs. Lisbon in particular is not super receptive to this idea, but she does eventually agree to host a chaperoned party at their house, which the neighbor boys are invited to and are very excited to attend because it gives them access to this enigmatic house that they are obsessed with. And while at the party, Cecilia is quite withdrawn and she asks to be excused from the party early, and she leaves the party and then dies by suicide while the party is still happening. And after Cecilia's death, the Lisbon parents become even more restrictive of their daughters. A new school year starts, and a guy named Trip Fontaine, played by Josh Hartnett, who is considered the school heartthrob, develops an infatuation with Lux. He wants to take her out on a date, but she tells him that her parents won't allow it. So he talks to Mr. Lisbon, who is also a teacher at their school. And Mr. Lisbon tells Trip that he can come to their house on Sunday night and watch TV with the entire family, which goes about as awkwardly as you would expect. And Trip really wants to take Lux to homecoming. And he persuades the Lisbon parents to allow this by saying he will bring dates for the other sisters so they can all attend in a group. And at homecoming, at first it's going really well. The girls are having a lot of fun. Lux and Trip are named Queen and King, but then Trip persuades Lux to ditch her sisters, and they have sex on the football field. And the rest of the sisters and their dates leave the dance without Lux in order to not miss curfew. And the next morning, Lux wakes up alone on the football field, Trip having abandoned her, and she takes the cab home. And when she gets home, her parents are very angry with her, and the girls' lives are restricted even further, with the parents withdrawing them from school. So the girls essentially have no more contact with the outside world. And this only furthers the neighbor boys' obsession with the sisters. And the boys spy on the sisters all the time using a telescope. And they start calling them and playing records over the phone rather than actually talking to them. And the Lisbon sisters eventually start leaving notes for the boys, and they communicate via Morse code. And the sisters eventually send a message that asks the boys to come to their house at midnight. And the boys think they are going to help the sisters escape and get out of town. And when they arrive, they are greeted by Lux, who invites them inside and says the other sisters are getting ready to leave. And while the boys wait, they discover that all of the sisters have killed themselves. And so the boys flee the house. It's later revealed that Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon move out of the neighborhood, and the rest of the neighborhood just acts like nothing has happened. And the closing narration reveals that the boys are still haunted by the sisters' deaths, even into adulthood.
Yeah, I think that sums it up.
So,
I don't really know what to... I feel like I had to say something, but it ends on such a...
I know, it's so sad. It's a really hard movie to describe straight through because so much of it is just rooted in the imagery and the mood. And I guess there kind of is one sustained plot arc in that you're building up to what the title suggests happening, but there's so many other smaller plot arcs within it that the structure feels non-traditional. And so just doing that read-through of everything that happens definitely isn't doing it justice.
Because also what makes this film so remarkable to me, and what made it so remarkable to me watching it when it came out, and I would have been 12 or 13, is the way that Sofia Coppola puts on display these artifacts of girlhood. Their rooms are so full of their lives. And there's this one scene in particular where there's like a pair of some kind of like hosiery, and it's just slung over a banister. And when the parents do allow them to have a party and the boys come over and, you know, is it Tripp that goes up to the bathroom? Or is it
no, it's a different boy.
It's one of those neighborhood boys. Yeah. And he goes up to the bathroom and there are just like so many tampons in the closet, and just the acts of living for these girls in this space is so palpable. That is where I think the film gets its strength. I have not read the book, and I did not read the book to talk about this film because I was like, well, you know what? If I've gone 25 years without reading it, I think I'm just going to keep it that way.
That was a good origin story. Is there anything else that you want to add?
Not really. Oh, and listen, Kirsten Dunst has really beautiful armpits. I don't know how I came to understand this. I'm sure it started when I watched The Virgin Suicides, when I watched her performance in The Virgin Suicides. And it sounds quite strange. Perhaps it is. But truly, it comes from a place of my own insecurities where I was always really insecure about my own armpits because they're like convex, not concave. And she just has these beautiful, smooth, sloping armpits. I just really admire and am envious of. And so I've always loved Kirsten Dunst's armpits. And fun fact, if you Google Kirsten Dunst's armpits, you will actually arrive at a series of images created for pornographic purposes from random other people in the world. So it's not as if I'm the only one. Maybe I'm not using them for pornographic purposes, but if that's your thing, that's fine. I'm just saying I'm not the only one that's noticed her armpits are nice. Yeah. So it's not that weird.
I just want to clarify that it's that pictures of her armpits have been uploaded to pornographic websites. It's not that images of her armpits are being manipulated and deep faked into porn.
Ew, yeah, no.
Yeah.
It's just
I don't want
actual.
anybody to get, yeah.
No, it's actual images of her armpit.
Yeah, they're just still images of her armpits from films and paparazzi. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So, as far, yeah. I don't think it's necessarily a breach in ethics that the armpit photos are on porn websites.
I don't think so.
They're just like normal pics of her arm.
Yes.
Anyways.
That's all it is. And then people are interpreting them at their discretion.
And you evangelize about the beauty of her armpits.
I do.
Because you literally sent the porn link one time in group chat with our fellow grad school cohort. Because you wrote a really beautiful piece that also featured mention of Kirsten Dunst's armpits. This was how I learned about this. It's all through you. And
Yeah.
now I can't think of her without thinking about how much you love her and her armpits.
They're really beautiful. We should admire them.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I forgot I sent that link. I sent it to some of my friends before too, and I was like, please don't send me armpit porn. I'm like, they're just pictures of her armpits on a porn site. You put it on a porn site and now it's porn? What is porn, really? This is getting off.
I love it. And now we've given you, dear listener, enough knowledge to find them on your own.
And I mean, I think there's something inherently sensual about admiring a specific body part on someone, especially a celebrity. Where do you draw the line between sensual admiration and pornographic arousal? Who's to say?
Who's to say?
Maybe Kirsten Dunst, if she's listening to this and she's like, please stop.
You know, sadly, I don't think this is the weirdest thing that has been put on the internet about her or any other given celebrity.
That's a good point. Nor is it the first time she's probably heard about her armpits being beautiful. There's just no way.
Yeah.
Not with those babies. She's just walking around like that. She's heard it before.
I'll have to send you a compilation of my favorite Kirsten Dunst paparazzi pics because she has some really good ones.
I would love that.
Including back when she used to date Jake Gyllenhaal. Anyway.
That was a mistake for her.
Well, now she's married to Jesse Plemons, and
They seem very happy.
they seem very happy, and
Together for a long
I
time.
support them wholeheartedly. Okay. Anything else?
No, that sums it
Okay.
up.
Okay. So I did not see this movie when it was first released because I would have been 1 year old. But when I was in high school, I read the novel. And I don't remember what compelled me to read the novel. I did not read it for class. I read it on my own volition. And I remember it being one of my first reading experiences where I was acutely aware of the language and was really taken in by the language and was heavily annotating the book and thinking it was this really beautiful, smart work. And I even I took a scan of the book, a page in the book, for a blackout poetry assignment in my high school creative writing class because I was so enthralled with so much of the language in it. The only reason I'm bringing up the book is that I read the book and then immediately watched the movie. So the two are very heavily intertwined in my memory. And I remember watching the movie and really liking it, being really, really stirred by that shot at the end of Bonnie's feet hanging in the top of the frame, and the boy who's standing with his back to her doesn't realize that she's there, and the other boys see it horrified, and it's just her saddle shoes after she has hung herself. And it scared me so much. It was just so arresting to me. And it has stayed in my brain for a decade. And all this is to say that with every subsequent Sofia Coppola movie that I watched over the years, my reaction was always, that wasn't as good as The Virgin Suicides. I would even go so far as to say that this is the only Sofia Coppola movie I have ever liked, though I have not seen all of her movies. And so in preparation for this episode, I felt like I had to reread the novel first and then rewatch the movie because I wanted to replicate that experience that I had when I was 16 or whatever of reading it and watching it so close together. It almost felt like watching it and reading it again for the first time. To give a little preview of where I come down, I think the story succeeds so much more as a film than a book, first of all. And I know we're not here to talk about the book, but I do think this is an interesting case of looking at what adaptation can accomplish when you're working with novel as source material. I think, one, the book is too long. The prose is portentous and bloated. And the thing with the book is that it's told from the point of view of these men who are looking back on their childhood. And the maleness is just so oppressive, which is perhaps the point. I do think that is the point. Like I said earlier, the boys have this misguided perception of who the girls were and what actually mattered when it came to their lives and their deaths. But just on the page, I find their cluelessness to be a lot less profound than it thinks it is. And I think this go round, what I really appreciated about the film is that, one, the Lisbon sisters, they feel like real people in a way they don't in the novel. And I think the disconnect between how the boys view the sisters versus who the sisters actually are feels a lot more palpable in this film than it does in the novel, which I think is partially a credit to Coppola, but I also think might just be inherent to the nature of film as opposed to literature, where you have these individual human beings who are embodying these characters and what that allows for emotional resonance and projection and whatnot. So all of that is to say, I really like this film. I'm really glad that we are talking about it.
Do you have a specific place you want to start?
Not really.
Okay. I don't either. I have a thought that's in my head. Could we just talk about my thought?
Yeah.
It's definitely something that I wanted to have a conversation about because the obvious sort of conundrum is that the title is The Virgin Suicides and Lux is not a virgin, at least in the sense of our patriarchal understanding of what virginity means and that it even is something to begin with. She has multiple lovers over the course of her short life. And I think it's clear that she is having sex with them. She's not just making out, which also, just to Coppola's credit, again, the way that the sex scenes are done feel very true to the story without me feeling uncomfortable with how she's being portrayed, given the fact she is meant to be a teenager. There are so many films where sex scenes of adolescent girls are pornographic in a way that feels really objectifying and violent, even if the sex is consensual, because their sexuality, I think, is often portrayed as being much more, quote unquote, experienced than what it really is when you're typically a teenager trying to have sex. It's not always very sexy. Anyway, maybe I've gone on a tangent there, but that felt important to me.
No, I think you're tapping into something true, which is that even though it is depicting Lux having sex, being a sexual person, the way in which those scenes are composed aesthetically doesn't feel like they are sexualizing her like body or Kirsten Dunst's body. And there's also this strain of melancholy in those scenes.
True.
Because when Trip convinces her to walk with him to the football field, you already kind of have this sinking feeling because at first she says she doesn't want to go because they need to leave soon, otherwise they'll break curfew. And she knows that there's a lot on the line for them to get home on time.
And she's drunk.
But he's like, no, let's just take a walk. And so they take a walk and they're on the football field. And I've never had sex on a football field, but I don't think that would be super comfortable. And there's this part where it's dark out, but a car drives by. And so you see the headlights of the car sort of flash over them. And so I would be really anxious about someone seeing me, about getting in trouble. And you just have this feeling like, oh, this is going to go badly. This is going to end badly for her. And it does, because they have sex. She misses her ride home because her sisters can't find her and they don't want to miss curfew, so they leave without her. And then she wakes up in the morning and he's abandoned her. And that's what sets in motion these other sexual experiences she has on the roof of their house. And the kind of vibe I get is it's just all driven by, I mean, a lot of it is related, I would think, to grief and feeling, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. But I think Coppola understands that it's like, yes, she is claiming some kind of sexual agency, but also there are layers to it. We're not just here to be voyeurs at a teen girl being sexual.
I think the word voyeur is really helpful. And I agree. I think what's happening is that we see Lux sexualizing herself. I don't feel like as an audience, I'm expected to sexualize her. That's what it is. She's embodying her own sexuality, and we are witnessing that. And that feels very different from a lot of other sex scenes.
Yeah.
Where teen girls are involved.
And added on to that is the fact that the boys are literally being voyeurs to her when she is having sex on her roof. They literally have a telescope and watch her all the time doing it. And the movie doesn't posit that as something that is just innocent curiosity, because it knows that it's not. It's more sinister than that. Would you call that violence, them watching her with the telescope?
I think so. I mean, because it's certainly invasive.
Right. Just because she's having sex on her roof, I don't think she thinks people can see her. I don't think she wants them to be watching her.
I would agree with that. And I think, too, it's complicated by the fact that, so as an adult, if as an adult you are having sex on a roof or having sex directly in front of a window, when you could close the blinds or not have sex on a roof, because again, you're an adult, you can utilize a space where people can't see you. Mm-hmm. I think that to some extent, if you're going to do that, is it weird if people watch you? Yeah. But also maybe don't do it in front of the window. And in this case, she has nowhere else to have sex. She has nowhere else to experience and express sexuality or sexual feelings. I'm not meaning to make a case for voyeurs that are looking into people's windows. I'm just saying in this case, she didn't have a choice about where she's having sex. I get the sense that if she had the opportunity to just have sex inside on a bed or in the house where people couldn't see, she would have been doing that.
I think that's exactly it, and that's what I was trying to get at. The presence of the boys is so complicated. And I understand why they're there. I understand why Eugenides wrote the book from their perspective, in the sense that he was once an adolescent boy. He wasn't ever an adolescent girl.
I like what you said about the film not positing, you can use that with an ing, right?
Yeah.
This idea that what the boys do by watching her through a telescope is like innocent fun. Mm-hmm. And I think though the way in which it is not positing that is by almost portraying it as this kind of boys will be boys and the violence of that in and of itself. She doesn't really have to go out of her way for them to seem in the wrong for what they're doing, because what they're doing is already wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know?
Something that I especially appreciated watching the movie now as an adult was the way that these really rich images, which you alluded to earlier, there are so many images in the film that I recognize from being in the book, like the closet full of tampon boxes, or when Cecilia is getting ready for her party and she's wearing bracelets all up her arms to cover her scars, and the sisters are taping the bracelets so they don't move, so no one can see her scars. That is a description that one of the boys in the novel describes, is how she has these bracelets all up her arms and they're taped that way. Images like that in the movie, just by the nature of film being a visual medium, they are freed from the male narration. What turns out in the movie to be this really poignant moment of her sisters, Cecilia's sisters, helping her get ready for this party by helping her cover up these scars that she doesn't want people to see. The boys aren't there, like, at all in that moment in the movie. But in the book, that entire moment is filtered through them and them hypothesizing about, like, oh, well, she came to the party with these bracelets all taped up, so that meant that her sisters must have helped her do it. And so because they are removed from the equation when it comes to these really evocative images of the inner life of these girls, the images feel just so much more evocative and emotionally resonant. Because while reading the novel, so many of these details, I'm like repelled by them, even though they're objectively very compelling at face value. And then those details, to me, they don't become truly compelling until I see them in the visual of the film. That male narration, it just feels like such an intrusion. And again, because I don't want people coming at me and telling me I have misunderstood this novel. I know that the point is that it feels like an intrusion. But I think I'm just at a point now in my life where teenage boys being this misguided towards teenage girls, I don't have a lot of patience for it anymore, in a way that I did when I was 16, because I thought it was moving that this male author was recognizing the ways teenage boys don't understand teenage girls. And now a decade has passed and I'm just like, get this away from me. I don't have any grace for you, even though they are children. So I'm like, should I have grace for them? It's a whole thing. It's been bothering me all week.
I feel like that line kind of takes me back to Romeo and Juliet for a moment, because yes, they are children, but they are enacting the violence of the world at large. And so the world is responsible for their behavior, but also they are enacting the behavior. And it also connects with this idea that we talked about in Miller's Girl with white feminism, where we are complicit in the patriarchy as white women, in part just because our whiteness assures us that we are complicit. And so that doesn't mean, though, that we aren't accountable for trying to combat that in any way that we can. It also doesn't mean we are entirely accountable. We need to hold the institutions responsible. And so it's a catch-22, maybe.
I think I would feel differently if the adult narration reflected some level of growth and understanding about the mistakes that the younger selves made. And it doesn't. And that is also part of the point, is that they are still hung up on this, even though they are grown men now with wives and their own children, these men are still hung up on the fantasy of who these girls were however many decades ago. So they don't see, one, the error of their ways, the error of their thinking, but they also just literally haven't changed in their perception of the Lisbon sisters and this world where they grew up. And so I think I would be more entitled to empathize with the adolescent misguidedness of these boys if there was any evidence that they eventually understood how misguided and creepy they were. But they don't.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. Yes, I keep saying I agree, but I just feel like we're on the pit. Like, we are locked in. My students say that all the time. I'm sorry. They'll be like, oh, they'll be super off topic. And they're like, sorry, Miss Dole, I got to lock in. I'm like, what?
That's so cute.
Yeah, I do love it. What I was thinking about, and this feels tangential, but I don't feel like it is that, yes, they are children, but then he grows up. He still doesn't take accountability. That's part of the problem. But even as children, I think we should have a higher expectation for their morality. We can tell these boys that they shouldn't be invading and weirdly obsessed, dangerously obsessed, I would say, with these teen girls. It's none of their fucking business.
And I guess where I come down on it, thinking specifically about the film, which I have said already, I think evokes the sisters and their sisterliness much better than the book does. I guess where I come down on it is it's just their lack of morality and ability to reckon with that just further compounds the tragedy that is this story. And I trust that Coppola understands that.
I think, too, there's a little juxtaposition where the girls are their parents are hyper attuned to their every move, whereas the boys seem to be able to move freely throughout the world, which obviously the patriarchy, but also I'm thinking about capitalism. And in the 70s, we have now women regularly, both parents are now working. So it's becoming less common to have parental supervision. And because it's new, I don't know that there were really a lot of social programs in place, like after school programs and things like that. I'm just thinking about this now. Maybe we just take this out because I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. But they definitely have a freedom that the girls don't. And some of that freedom feels like maybe they could have used a little more supervision that they weren't getting. And that alone has made their behavior possible.
Yeah. And I think that also plays into the ways in which this story can be read as, I don't know if deconstruction is the right word, a demythologizing of suburbia and how white flight happened to make suburbs, right? This idea that the city is now dangerous, so we upper middle class white folks must leave and create our own little neighborhood havens. Which is not to say that suburbs are always exclusively white. Just want to make that clear. But in this film, they are rendered, I think, exclusively white. And this idea that, oh, it's this space where it's all about keeping up this specific appearance. And part of that is, well, our kids can just run around in the neighborhood and we don't have to worry about them getting abducted or whatever. But as the movie shows, even within this so-called perfectly safe environment, there are still teenage girls who are depressed and suicidal. It's not actually this perfect environment that these people want to act like it is. And I think that is part of the deal with the boys, is they can't fathom why these girls would be so unhappy. To start with Cecilia, they can't fathom why Cecilia, who's only 13, would be so unhappy that she would try to kill herself. Mm-hmm. And then after Cecilia does die, they can't fathom the fact that the rest of the sisters would also be so unhappy that they would make a suicide pact. When, one, their sister is dead, no one is talking about it. No one is talking about the fact that this young girl killed herself. The neighborhood's not talking about it. The parents aren't talking about it. No one has been given any space to process what this means or why this might have happened. And I think part of that is because, well, we live in this perfect suburb where bad things don't happen. And I think that plays into the boys' perceptions of the Lisbon family as well.
Yeah, and I think going off of that, we can view the boys as a group as being representative of the way that institutional violence affects every aspect of society, regardless of affluence. I do want to go back really quick to Lux's character.
Yes, please.
Because we started talking about her sexuality, but I feel like I didn't finish talking about the fact that this film is called The Virgin Suicides. However, she's not a virgin. The way that I have interpreted it for myself is that if we want to assume that virginity is real, so this argument assumes that this idea of virginity, of having some level of purity and then not having it anymore, exists, because you can make an argument that it doesn't. I typically would lean towards virginity isn't real as a conception. And certainly it is real, but it's like a damaging one. Anyway, what she is seeking isn't sexual fulfillment. So in this sense, she has not lost her quote unquote virginity, because she's not having sex with these boys because she's obsessed with losing her virginity, or because she's even particularly sexually curious. Because when she does have sex with them, and I think we learn this through the boys narrating, even in the film, is that after she has sex with a boy, she asks, like, do you love me? She is looking for emotional connection. And she seems to think that emotional connection is through sexual connection. But that's clearly not what these boys are interested in. And so I think in the sense she's still a virgin because she has not come to an understanding of her own desire. And so if we are going to assume that virginity is a real thing, let's at least make it something that matters. If virginity is real, then it is when you get as close as you can to an understanding of what you want, an understanding of your own desire. I feel like I say that a lot, but I just think it's really important. And in that sense, she has not even come close to losing her virginity.
That's a really compelling argument. I guess the moment where she maybe comes closest to understanding her desire is when she runs after Tripp when he watches TV at their house. Because Tripp wants to take Lux out and her parents won't let him. And the dad says that he can come over and watch the tube. He's sitting on their couch and they're all there. And the mom is reading from the TV guide about some nature documentary that's on. And, oh, we could watch that. And it's really awkward. And it's kind of endearing, too. Even though I know things are eventually going to go to shit, it instills me with a little bit of hope. You know, they're watching the TV, and this is clearly not what Tripp Fontaine had in mind for a first date with this girl. And he leaves, and he just gets in his car, and he's like, what the fuck was that? And he sees the lights in the house go off. And then Lux runs out of the house, runs into his car. She like gets in his lap, if I remember right, and starts very enthusiastically kissing him and gets out of the car and leaves. And he's like ecstatic, and she bounces back inside. That to me felt like the purest distillation of desire and agency in one thing. But the word virginity is so tied with sexual intercourse that I wouldn't ever think to call that a type of virginity loss because it was just kissing. But also when you're 15 years old and you're kissing this hot guy in his car, it's not just kissing, it's everything.
I think in that moment she really did experience desire of her own volition. And I really do feel like she did that because she just really wanted to make out with him. That's how it reads to me.
Yeah.
And not because in that moment she was thinking, she was calculating like, oh, I need to make out with him so that he'll love me. And the word virginity, yes, it has historically been tied to this idea of sexual intercourse, which is also very heteronormative. Right. And I think you could make a really great argument that our cultural use of the word virginity is not just heteronormative, but like homophobic. Because it also assumes that you can't lose your virginity unless you are having sex with someone of the opposite sex. Because I don't hate the idea of there being some kind of a threshold when you are learning about your body and your desires. But why do we have to be so specific about it? We don't. I think just we need to start talking about it in a different way. We can even keep using the word virginity, but we need to change the definition.
Yeah. That's like a millennia of cultural undoing, though.
I mean, I just did it. Now we just keep doing it.
That's true. That's true. That's very true. In light of this moment of a positive thing happening to Lux, can I talk about something else that I like? Before it goes to shit, I love the homecoming sequence in this movie. Something that I, again, really appreciate about this adaptation is that it is not entirely dour. Obviously, the title kind of gives away the ending, you know. But the movie ensures that the life preceding these very tragic deaths was not entirely joyless, which I think is lacking in the novel. And again, a lot of the plot details and the way the scenes unfold, they are the same in the film as they are in the book, but just something about them being rendered with real people, real girls, and the other filmmaking techniques that exist. It just was so poignant and really humanizing in a way that I think that is really important. Because even before they get to the dance, when these boys show up at the house to pick up the girls, and all 8 of them, there's 4 girls and 4 boys, they're all piled in one car together. Mm-hmm. And there's that scene where they're driving down the street and the sisters are cracking jokes about their neighbors and pointing out other things about neighborhood gossip. They're talking almost like the boys aren't there. And you see the boys just watching them and reacting to them. And I can only imagine that the direction they were given was really good, because you just sort of see the boys' faces open up as they're watching these girls be themselves in the car. And you see them start to realize, oh, this is what they're actually like. And I like who they are. And it's so sweet. And you can just tell everyone is really happy and is excited to have a good time. And then they get to the dance and there's these close-ups of the different couples taking hands as they walk to the dance floor and they prepare to dance. And you know, Maggie, how I am about hands. hand-holding to me is like what Kirsten Dunst's armpits are to you. I know when I am being manipulated by a film usually, but I will always be okay being emotionally manipulated with a scene of hand-holding. It's just who I am, okay? And so when it's these girls who have had just the shittiest fucking year ever, being led to the dance floor, holding hands with these boys, and you can see the jolts of excitement in them, and it's kind of awkward, but it's also full of discovery and electricity. In those few minutes, I felt so good. And I just really love that Coppola took the time to craft this bubble of perfection for them. And then, of course, Trip ruins it. But that was all I wanted to say. I just really love that whole sequence.
I also love that whole sequence because it is cute and it's cute.
It is cute. And not in a diminutive way, but
no, it's
in this
fulfilling.
Right.
Yeah. There's like a richness to the cuteness. It feels nostalgic watching it and how awkward they are and how excited they are. And something that I love about this film, putting it in conversation with Miller's Girl for a moment, is that these girls have been oppressed by the world in which they live, but they are not empowered by their oppression. Whereas in Miller's Girl, I think we at least came to a conclusion that our protagonist was empowered by her abuse, was empowered by her trauma, and that was very problematic. And these girls are not. In fact, it destroys them, which is what oppression does. The fact that they were able to have this joyful experience also combats the narrative that they were somehow empowered by this oppression merely just by allowing them to have a very normal experience. Because at no point in Miller's Girl, well, maybe I shouldn't say no point, but for the most part, the protagonist's experience didn't feel situated in reality, which was part of the point. But these girls feel very real.
Yes.
They're allowed to be real and flawed, and they're more dynamic, I guess. And their victimization is insidious and complicated. Because I think part of their victimization is coming from their mother not wanting them to be a part of the world, but their mother not wanting to be a part of the world is coming from this fear of how the world will treat them as young girls, and she's not wrong. And I don't know if I got anywhere with that, but I do mean all of those things that I said.
I think that those are all good points, because the other key component to this homecoming sequence is that their dad is present at that dance. He is a teacher at their school. He is chaperoning the dance. That's part of the deal as to why they get to go, is that he will be there to make sure nothing untoward happens. And after Lux and Trip are named homecoming queen and king, there are those balloons that fall from the ceiling, and that song is playing. What's that song? The Styx one. Come Sail Away. It's like a super cheesy power ballad. And there's these balloons falling from the ceiling, and everyone is so happy, and the girls are dancing with their dates and laughing and talking about how much fun they're having. And there's this quick shot of the dad, and you can see how happy he is because he's seeing his daughters experience joy for the first time in who knows how long. And in that moment, I think he understands, oh, this is what they needed. They needed to get out of that house. They need to be a part of the world. Even if the world can be scary and dangerous, they still need to be a part of the world. But he doesn't have the integrity to stand up for that conviction when the fallout from the dance happens and Lux comes home the next morning late. Because I think the parent dynamic is tricky in this movie in that the mom is the one who seems to be the primary factor in keeping the girls home and isolating them from the world. But the dad is he just gets to be this sort of aloof dork who doesn't make any effort for the most part. He does talk to his wife about maybe we should let the girls go to homecoming. But the mom had a big role creating this stifling environment that made the girls really unhappy. But I don't feel comfortable putting it all on her.
How I see the parent dynamic is that the dad, because he clearly really is kind of goofy, but also loves engaging with children, with sharing his interests. Mm-hmm. We see that in the way that he talks with the boys.
Right.
About his like planes or something like that. And I think maybe he feels like he can't connect with the girls in the same way. And I don't think that that's necessarily his fault. That feels like society setting this expectation for him that you're a man. You don't know how to connect with your own daughters. They're your fucking children. Talk to them, you know? And I think it's clear that he does really love them and he wants the best for them. And I think what happens is when he brings up these concerns about allowing them to be in the world when talking to his wife is that it's really difficult to refute his wife's concerns for them in the world. And ultimately, he hasn't been a girl in the world. He's been a boy and then a man. I don't see it as dismissive so much as him doubting his own ability to make decisions for his children because they are girls. And that feels like much bigger than a marital issue. It feels like a societal issue that has wreaked havoc on their parenting styles.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I didn't end up getting to my intersexuality. No. I never made it there, but I was going to. I'll just bring us there now.
Perfect.
So for my intersexuality, I have two. The first one I'm going to talk about is Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. And the movie adaptation of this book came out, I looked it up and now I can't remember, but it came out around the same time as The Virgin Suicides. I watched
think it was 99.
Was it?
I'm pretty sure because Angelina Jolie either won her Oscar for that movie in 2000 or 2001.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Because I know that I saw them around the same time. I did not rewatch the movie to have this conversation because I didn't really want to talk about the comparison. It's not where I wanted to steer the conversation. I am going to rewatch it after this, but I knew I would be tempted to steer the conversation in that way if I rewatched it before. Girl Interrupted is written by Susanna Kaysen, a woman. The film, though, is directed by a man. So kind of like opposite to what's happening here. I don't have any commentary on that, but I would encourage you to watch Girl Interrupted and come up with your own commentary. It's a memoir, and it's so good. It is hilarious and deeply insightful, and I love it so much. And it's a memoir about the writer's experience being in a psychiatric ward for about 2 years in the late 60s. I want to say 1968 was around the time she was admitted, and she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and had suicidal ideations. And in this chapter called My Suicide, she talks about her experience and her feelings around that. And so I just want to read a passage from it real quick and then talk about it. She says, "My motives were weak. An American history paper I didn't want to write, and the question I'd asked months earlier, why not kill myself? Dead, I wouldn't have to write the paper, nor would I have to keep debating the question. The debate was wearing me out. Once you've posted that question, it won't go away. I think many people kill themselves simply to stop the debate about whether they will or they won't. Anything I thought or did was immediately drawn into the debate. Made a stupid remark? Why not kill myself? Missed the bus? Better put an end to it all. Even the good got in there. I like that movie. Maybe I shouldn't kill myself. Actually, it was only part of myself I wanted to kill. The part that wanted to kill herself. That dragged me into the suicide debate and made every window, kitchen implement, and subway station a rehearsal for tragedy." And what I love so much about this passage is, and as somebody who spent time in a psychiatric unit as an adolescent, and she was 18, I believe, at the time that she was admitted, is that sometimes I feel like the question of suicide is placed in this context of some grand gesture in response to a trauma. But what I think that the film illustrates well, it's strange to say well in this case, but what I do think it's doing a good job of is illustrating that the motives for suicide do not have to be grand or for even like for significant reasons. They must only exist, and that's it. The reasons must only exist, and they are secondary even to the desire to not live anymore. And that's really what is propelling our characters forward. They have a quote-unquote good life, but they are oppressed by it. And especially as teenagers, what autonomy do they have to escape it? And so that, coupled with mental illness, makes the question of suicide easy to approach very flippantly. Like, I'm having a bad day. Maybe I should kill myself. And it could be that simple. I think that that is what's happening with these girls. Because not only do they not have the tools to really work through their feelings, this is also the 70s, so there's not a real understanding of mental illness. Even in the 90s, we didn't really have a good understanding of it. Or at least we weren't talking about it in the way that we do now. And I don't think that they chose to take their own lives in response to the trauma of their younger sister dying. It was in response to the trauma of the world not recognizing them as autonomous beings, and to the world not really recognizing, and by the world I mean just the people around them and their own parents, not recognizing the trauma. It's not the trauma itself, it's just how it's dealt with or ignored that can further propel people who are already maybe inclined to have suicidal ideation to actually follow through.
I think what you're saying is tapping into this rhetoric I remember hearing when I was a child, which is perhaps still relevant, I don't know. But when children would have certain emotional struggles, or what some might categorize as outbursts, it was often chalked up to the inherent drama of being a teenager. Which I'm not saying teenagers can't be dramatic for drama's sake. What I remember witnessing as a kid was this idea of parents specifically wanting to find a way to rationalize why a child might be feeling suicidal. And so rather than deal with the issue head on, which is that this child wants to potentially end their life, they're looking for reasons why they don't actually want to end their life. Which, like Kaysen is pointing out in her book, and you're pointing out in relation to this movie, is the why kind of doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It's that ideation and desire is there. Once that has been made known, nothing else matters. And I think that is also what the boys' fixation with the why in the Virgin Suicides is tapping into. The obsession with the why, I think that is something that permeates into life. And I think perhaps especially is present when related to adolescents who are struggling with their mental health. Mm-hmm. Did that make sense?
No, it definitely did. I think that it helped really sort of, it's a good like synthesis of what I was trying to get at. I'm going to read another passage. And this argument isn't fully formed in my mind. It might not work out, but we're going to try it. Okay,
good.
We're going to try it. That's why we're here. This is in the chapter called Elementary Topography. She talks about what she refers to as the state of contrariety. My ambition was to negate. The world, whether dense or hollow, provoked only my negations. When I was supposed to be awake, I was asleep. When I was supposed to speak, I was silent. When a pleasure offered itself to me, I avoided it. My hunger, my thirst, my loneliness, and boredom and fear were all weapons aimed at my enemy, the world. They didn't matter a whit to the world, of course, and they tormented me, but I got a gruesome satisfaction from my sufferings. They proved my existence. All my integrity seemed to lie in saying no. So the opportunity to be incarcerated in this mental health facility was just too good to resist. It was a very big no, the biggest no this side of suicide. I feel like what is happening, if these girls had had the opportunity to, because they don't receive any, I mean, they have Danny DeVito for like 5 minutes.
Yes.
But it's not really for them. It's really him talking to their parents. And then after the youngest sister dies, we at least don't see it in the film. I get the sense as an audience that they don't seek further mental health support for their living daughters or for themselves. I feel like I'm venturing into dangerous territory by saying what I'm about to say, because I think it starts to traverse the horrible notion that is repeated over and over again in art, that there is something beautiful and profound about dead women and girls. And I think I'm going to say it anyway, knowing that it does traverse into that territory, because I know my intentions are to not go there. But their suicide is this kind of no. It's a refusal. It's the autonomy that they had, which is to say none at all. But sometimes the only autonomy we have is to say no and is to refuse. And in this case, unfortunately, it was to refuse the act of living, which you could argue was already taken from them, given they weren't even allowed to leave their home. Which also made me think about a piece in Anne Boyer's book, A Handbook of Disappointed Fate. And the essay or poem or whatever you want to call it is called No. And in it she says, refusal, which is only sometimes a kind of poetry, does not have to be limited to poetry. And turning the world upside down, which is often a kind of poetry, doesn't have to be limited to words. Words are useful for upending the world in that they are cheap, ordinary, portable, and generous, and they don't mess us up too badly if we use them wrong. Not like matches or machetes. But poetry is made up of ideas and figurations and tropes and syntaxes as much as it is made up of words. We can make a poetry without language because language as the rehearsal material of poetry has made the way for another poetry, that of objects, actions, environments, and their arrangement. This is not saying to be a poet means you can only rehearse turning over the world. Now try putting the chair on your head. Obviously, the title itself made me think of having these writers talk to each other. But because the idea of dead women and girls has been glorified, that as a teenage girl, that to some extent is internalized. And I think that in that way, there is a danger of seeing your own dead body as a kind of poetry. And like Anne Boyer says, the words are useful for upending the world in that they are cheap, ordinary, portable, and generous, and they don't mess us up too badly if we use them wrong. But when we tell young girls that their dead bodies are a kind of poetry, that is beyond words. That becomes an image, and that image becomes an action, and that action takes their lives.
I think that is incredibly profound. If we have internalized as girls who became women this idea that our dead body can potentially be a source of poetry, if we have internalized that, then it only makes sense that we talk about it, which is what you have just done. And sometimes talking about that will involve invoking the thing we have internalized. But if it's internalized, the goal is to exercise it. So you have to talk about it in order to exercise it, which means acknowledging that it's already in there and has been enacted in some way. What you said also made me think about our conversation about Romeo and Juliet, where you said that obviously suicide is not a choice we ever want anyone to make for themselves. But when you look at these specific circumstances that were placed upon these two children in this play, it makes sense why they believed they had no other option. And in truth, what options did they have? That is a really difficult question that we have to ask, is what options are we giving children, or lack thereof, so they think that the only option is suicide?
Thank you.
Thank you. What you were saying also reminded me of this essay, which I don't even know what part I want to talk about in it because there were so many parts, and I was like, I'm just going to have to see where the conversation goes, and eventually I'll pick a part, because this essay is called Our Sisters Shall Inherit the Sky. It is by Alana Massey, and it is in her essay collection, All the Lives I Want, essays about my best friends who happen to be famous strangers. And this is a book of essays that's very much about the intersection between the cultural and the personal. And so she's examining these various pop culture figures and pop culture artifacts and how they related to her girlhood and her womanhood and her mental health. She's very open about the various illnesses that she has had. And she has an essay in here about the virgin suicides and the experience of seeing the film with her sister and then immediately reading the book when she was a teenager. So she had the inverse experience of me, where she saw the film first and that inspired her to read the book. And then she's revisiting the book as an adult. I'm going to read this part first. In this part of the essay, Massey is talking about the novel specifically and the narration by the boys. She says, though the boys never admit as such, it is crucial that the Lisbon sisters are all thin and beautiful within reason. There are a handful of imperfect features among them, but nothing that would make the sum of each one's parts less than desirable. In the safety of being attractive, their eccentricities are as precious as their bodies. Their bodies protect all eccentricity from becoming strange or gross in the way similar predilections are characterized when possessed by heavier or uglier girls. And then she goes on to say, the men who narrate are softened by their surrender to age and hardened to the women they married, for having aged into the fullness of living real human lives. They resent these women for forcing them to reckon with the full humanity of women in a way that the dreamy Lisbon sisters never forced them to. The Lisbon sisters died before they ever came close enough to reveal their second and third dimensions. And I think, not to bring everything back to the novel, which I have said I have issues with, but to do exactly that, part of my resistance to truly empathizing with these teenage boys is that they, as Massey has so astutely put it, have made their own poetic fiction out of these dead girls' bodies. And they don't even understand that they've done that. Or they do understand because they talk about, and this narration is in the movie too, where they talk about how even when they're with their wives, they're imagining the Lisbon sisters. They are aware that in their psyches, no other woman can ever compare. But I think their mental fucked upness views that as a tragedy that has befallen them as opposed to their own doing. And I think this movie asks me less than the book to empathize with that. Which is why I think this film is so much more successful in telling this story.
But, of course, the truth at the heart of the story lies in the dimensionality of the girls.
Right.
The way that Massey puts it is so succinctly accurate. I wish I could write sentences like that.
It's so good.
Oh my God.
She's so sharp.
And this idea that these boys grew up and they're like, fuck you for dying on us before you could reveal who we really are to ourselves. We were counting on you to help us become men. And now we're stuck in a part of us. There will be a part of me as a man that's always going to be stuck in boyhood now because you didn't explain yourself to me. The girls owed the boys something, I think. They feel like they were, like something was taken from them.
Yes, because Massey later says, at the end of her essay, she says, the boys are traumatized not by the deaths of the girls, but by their own impotence. Meaning, they are traumatized by the fact that they couldn't save the girls. Because they could have swore that these girls were beckoning us to save them. And it turns out that actually wasn't it. And I think that is all much clearer in Coppola's directorial vision. But I did want to ask you about the scenes involving adult Trip. So the movie is being narrated by this adult man, and it's pretty clear that we're recollecting his childhood and growing up on the same street as the Lisbons and whatnot. And I think it happens twice, where we cut to this man who we learn is in a rehab facility. And in the book, it's clear that it's for alcohol addiction. And we don't see who he's talking to. He's just talking to the camera, but it's clear he's being interviewed by presumably the adult narrator of the film. And he's talking about his experience loving Lux when he was a teenager. And so it's this very quick jump into the future, or into the present, I guess, where we dwell on what happened to this adult man who knew the girls briefly. And that's part of the novel. But there's a lot of other stuff in the present. The boys who are now men have created this whole catalog of artifacts from the girls' lives because when the parents moved out of their house after all their daughters died, there was just a bunch of their shit on the street. And so the boys went through it to take these artifacts from the girls. And part of the adult narration in the novel is that they have cataloged all these artifacts. They refer to them as artifact number 72 or whatever. Yeah, Maggie is making a concerned face. And part of that is that they also conduct interviews with people who knew the Lisbons, one of whom is this adult Trip Fontaine. But a lot of that is erased from the film narrative, except for them interviewing adult Trip Fontaine, which I found really curious. And it made me wonder if Coppola had filmed more of that stuff and cut it, didn't actually put it in the film, or if she specifically wrote it that they just talked to Trip in adulthood and no one else. I think it's briefly alluded to that they talked to the mom too, because there's one point at the end where the mom is saying, our house was never lacking for love. And it's clear that she's speaking with distance between the suicides. But Trip gets 2 scenes. And he talks about how he loved her, and then he talks about that decision to leave her on the football field. Mm-hmm. I was just curious what you thought of that.
I wonder if it was very intentional. Not that I think, Coppola is not an intentional filmmaker. I just mean if she only filmed those scenes with Trip Fontaine and not with other people who had been interviewed, the word dilution is coming to mind. I wonder if including all the other interviews, if it would have diluted not necessarily the responsibility, but the invasiveness of the boys' actions. Because the film is happening in a series of images. So the more images I have of people talking about the Lisbon girls in this voyeuristic way, even though they weren't holding the telescope through the window, it would, to me, still dilute the culpability of the boys' behavior and their lack of accountability as grown men.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The other thing I'm also just now thinking of is this notion that Trip is the one person they know who got to quote unquote love one of the Lisbon sisters, because the way that the novel ends and the way the narration ends in the film is, it says, the point is that we had loved them and they hadn't heard us calling. And it's like, okay, yes, you were infatuated with them. Did you love them? What is love when you're 14? But I don't think surveilling these sisters with a telescope in your bedroom, that's not love, in my opinion. But that's clearly something that they aspired to, or they've deluded themselves into believing happened. But Trip is the person who actually got to be, for even just the briefest period of time, part of that sister dynamic, in terms of, he says that he loved her, and he still attests that even when he's an adult, even though he treated her horribly. He's like, I've never loved another girl like that. So the focus on him specifically, it feels like this very clear extension of the boys' obsession, where it's like, okay, if we didn't get to have this close contact with the sisters, you're the one person who did. So we're gonna interview you about your experience 20 years later or whatever. Which also makes me wonder about the depiction of Trip more generally. Because, one, I think the casting of Josh Hartnett as young Trip is really smart. Because he was obviously this heartthrob at the time. And so casting him as the stereotypical heartthrob at this school And then upending that by having him be a total dick rather than your traditional romantic hero feels like a really smart way to play on the expectations people would have had for a Josh Hartnett character and performance. But there's also this part of me that wonders if this focus on adult Trip is meant to invoke a certain kind of sympathy for him. Because it's like, oh, look what happened to the heartthrob. He's still not over the girlfriend he had when he was 16, and now he's an alcoholic in rehab. But I don't think Coppola would be that delusional. It's just very fascinating to me. And it's okay that I can't quite put my thumb on what is happening with that choice, but...
To me, it felt like a kind of retribution. Like, look, he was a fucking asshole then,
right,
and he's still a fucking asshole. And not that alcoholism isn't a real mental health issue. Addiction should be treated like any other mental health issue that people need support in order to manage. But he's an asshole. If he had the fucking courage, he's a coward, to have a conversation with Lux after he just left her in the football field, which, to be fair, he wouldn't have been given an opportunity to, but he didn't try. We know that. I feel like he'd be the kind of guy that would say something like, yeah, this is just who I am, and I'm just not good for you. I'm just not good enough for you. Instead of actually trying to change his behavior. Whenever a dude says that, like, I'm just not good enough for you, that's just them saying, I don't want to change my behavior. And I think you are somebody who would hold me accountable to it at some point. Which I do think Lux would.
Right. And I also interpret his leaving right after they have sex and not even saying goodbye and abandoning her on the field. I also read that as, like, at some point that night, some sort of illusion he had about her got shattered and she became a real person to him, and he couldn't handle that. Which is interesting considering he is this male mythic counterpart within their school. That sequence when his character is first introduced and he's walking down the hall and everyone is staring, I love it so much. It's so goofy and playful, and Coppola just understands so well the rendering of the guy who was a heartthrob who everyone was obsessed with, but in hindsight we realize he really wasn't that great or attractive, Like with the hair, it just really, truly terrible, untrustworthy haircut.
Yeah, it's bad.
In our last episode, when you confused Josh Hartnett with Ashton Kutcher, your point of reference was it's that he's played by that guy who was in that 70s show. And you're talking about Ashton Kutcher. And watching the movie, I was like, Trip Fontaine does have Michael Kelso hair. Mm-hmm. So I do understand. I think Josh Hartnett is much prettier than Ashton Kutcher. But I do understand your confusion.
It was confusing. And I didn't even really watch that 70s show. But we all know that character. And they look exactly the same to me. But in my defense, well, maybe not in my defense, a lot of celebrities do. Like, there are a lot of celebrities I can't actually tell them apart.
I think that's healthy. So, you're probably better off for it.
I think so.
Yeah. So, what was my point?
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It was literally my fault. I was the one who was like, yeah, he does kind of look like Michael Kelso. But yeah, so when she breaks through and no longer becomes this mythic figure to him, that's when he bails. And the sense you get up to that point is that maybe he's looking for someone who doesn't view him as a mythic figure. Because that's part of the allure of her, is that she's not immediately fawning all over him. He just can't handle her being a real person. And that just goes back to the cowardice, like you mentioned. It's cowardice and it's weakness.
Because as soon as another person that especially if you've been intimate with them in some way, not just sexually, becomes a real person to you, you have to contend not only with their personhood, but your own in relation to their proximity to you now. And so he could not face that again because he's a coward.
Yeah. Good movie.
Yeah. Nice. Great job.
Everyone involved.
Good job.
Yeah.
Not Ashton Kutcher, who is not in this movie.
Who was not in this movie. Danny DeVito, who was in one scene at the beginning. Good job.
Yes, we love you, Danny DeVito.
Anyway, what does this movie make you want to tell your younger self?
Oh, Marin. I think that what I would tell her is that there's like a bluntness to this. And I'm hesitant to say it, but it's the first thing I thought of, which is that your dead body is not poetry.
I think that's great.
Because I didn't know that. I thought that it was. I mean, there were a lot of reasons why I wanted to die. But none of them really mattered. Like Kaysen talks about. I was sick and there was trauma. And it's always more complicated than what it may seem. But I certainly was, I keep saying the word propelled, but it just feels like the most appropriate one. I certainly was propelled towards suicidal ideations because I thought there was something poetic about dead girls. I wonder if I had not been fed that narrative, if I would have been able to more quickly reckon with the fact that my response to the world was, I don't want to say inappropriate, but was not of my own volition necessarily. It was a variety of factors, like I already said, most of which I didn't really have control over.
That's good. That's really good. What does this movie make me want to tell my younger self? This movie makes me want to tell my younger self that sometimes as you get older, things will mean less to you than they did when you were younger. And I guess I'm technically talking about the novel now, but my relationship with the novel is so intertwined with the book just because I experienced them for the first time so close together. And sometimes that can be sad when you realize that something you loved when you were young no longer means the same thing to you. Sometimes that can be sad. And it's okay that it's sad, but also sometimes it reflects a better understanding of yourself and the world. And I think whatever I needed from this book when I was 16 years old, I needed it at that moment in time. And now I don't need that anymore. And I turned out okay. And so I would just tell her that that happens. But then sometimes, conversely, things which didn't necessarily mean as much to you when you were younger will mean more to you later. And I think that's what's happened with this film.
That's good.
Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. We would love it if you subscribed on your podcast listening platform of choice. We would love it if you turn on post notifications so you don't ever miss a new episode. We would love it if you gave us a rating. That would help us. Or if you know someone who you think would like the show. Word of mouth recommendations. We would love that and appreciate that.
You can check the show notes for the secondary texts we referenced. And you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Tell Me I'm Sorry. And email us your own musings and questions at tellmeimsorry@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at _Saint_Margaret_ if I have it activated. I intermittently deactivate it for my mental health. So,
which is a good choice. I mean, whatever choice is best for your mental health is a good choice.
Yeah.
Just generally speaking, to whoever need to hear that. If you want to follow me on Letterboxd, you can at Marin Harrington. If you want to see other movies that I have been watching, gets weird over there. So you never know what you're gonna get. And I'll be logging another movie soon because I'm about to reveal what we're gonna talk about next. The past 2 weeks, I've been firm in my choice. I was like, this is the movie I'm gonna pick next. And then today, I was going through my calendar and I realized that the next movie I pick, the episode will be released in October. And I only get one October pick because we each pick one movie a month. And so I was like, oh, I have to pick something for Halloween because on September 10th, we're releasing our Cruel Intentions episode. September 24th, this episode will be released. And so the movie I'm about to say, the episode will be released October 8th. And I was like, I gotta pick something that I want to watch for spooky season. So the other movie that I initially picked is on the back burner for now. And I have picked, again, this was on a total whim. We're staying in the 90s. Okay. We're here. I like that we're here. I might have started rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer this past weekend, which I haven't watched since I was 16, and I'm already almost done with the first season. And I'm having so much fun. And so I just, whatever. It's my own little nostalgic bubble. And so the movie I have selected next to celebrate spooky season and girlhood is the classic slasher film Scream.
Nice.
Starring Drew Barrymore.
Yeah.
And other people.
But mostly Drew Barrymore. In my heart.
Well, not really.
In my heart.
We will talk about Drew Barrymore, though, and the profound impact she had on me. So.
That's exciting.
I'm excited.
I was actually doing the same calculation today. Being like, well, so my next pick will also be with that in mind, even if it won't. Well, yours will come out on the 8th.
Yes, so yours
Mine will come out.
Yeah. So yours would be 2 weeks after that. So closer to Halloween, but it would still be October. Okay. Get ready. What's your favorite scary movie? Isn't that's what he says? He says it in a scarier voice than that.
Yeah, that was scary. What's
your favorite scary movie?
Yeah, that actually was
scary. Children? Okay, this is...
No, leave it in. They're going to be terrified.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.